Hello, my name is Rodanthi Tzanelli and I am based at the University of Leeds in sociology. I'm going to talk to you today about world making and the economy of desire in Rio 2016. It is a presentation that it's been inspired by and follows in brushstrokes my book on the mega events of Rio and the forthcoming mega events of Tokyo 2020. I do provide you with a bibliography, the main inspirations on which my presentation is based. It is a development of some of the themes from my book. So what is an economy of desire in Rio 2016? We have the conventional definitions, which consider it under discursive formations that we associate with political economy and geopolitical ecologies. These are inspired mainly by politics and international relations because they look the definition looks at the organization of the Olympic Games as a kind of pact for any mega event host. In this particular conjunction of circumstances, the economy of desire allows postcolonial Rio to enter the world of pacts and values which are upheld by global communities of nations and international business conglomerates, because in the organization of and the sustaining of the Olympics and the Olympic values, both nations and international business participate. So the pact itself is to organize, to host an Olympic Games in an ordered, clean and hospitable way, and also for the host to cater for the security and the needs of its international guests, including the athletes and of course the mega event tourists and audiences. The universal values on which the organization is based are a blend of the Olympic and the Paralympic values: friendship, respect, excellence, determination, inspiration, courage and equality. The values underpin the games as a set of universal principles, but they can be applied to education and generally our lifestyles. And of course, they inform the spirit of sport and competition in general. So these are the kind of universal values, but then we have also the values upheld by the host. Of course, the host has the opportunity through the organization of the events to promote their own tradition and heritage. So this is a conventional definition of the economy of desire, which refers to generally a desire for inclusion in a global polity through symbolic transactions which secure the recognition of the host. We can think of it as a theory of cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan communication. I would say that this is not the entire story, and I would like to revisit the notion of desire and actually redefine it a bit, tweak it a bit, to take it out of the European theories of cosmopolitanism and apply the new mobilities paradigm and more specifically notions and theories of mobility justice, but also tourism mobilities and mobile art. Let's think about Rio. Rio is a city, medium-sized city, it's hierarchically, on the global hierarchy of cities, is not one of the biggest ones, but is one of the most well-known ones. And of course the aspiration here with a mega event would be to reach, basically achieve the reputation of a global city like Tokyo. Now we have to think here along the lines of what Boltanski and Tzanelli argue. We have to think of cities as kind of fields wherein justices are played out, or injustices, in particular logical conjunctions. Every city has its highs and lows when it comes to the organization and maintenance of justice networks. And this can be achieved in a variety of ways. Every city has its own aspirations to achieve a few things. To join markets, for Rio in particular, the target was to become more networked as a city. To achieve good reputation, of course, amongst previous Olympic hosts and the International Olympic Committee, and so on and so forth, and of course to invite press coverage, international press coverage, which would be favorable. So good reputation, and then of course to reorganize and improve its industries, so this is industrial formations, and also improve its civic alliances. These are kind of fields within the urban field. And of course every city achieves betterment along these lines in different ways. There are no predetermined paths to development. We need to always examine carefully the socio-historical context in which a city moves, the kind of mobilities it invites, the kind of mobilities that are enforced upon the city, and on that we cannot really stick to traditional understandings of cosmopolitanism to look at patterns of movement. In fact, there are particular branches of cosmopolitanism, such as critical cosmopolitanism, that butt heads with the new mobilities paradigm, thinking of it as not sociological enough. I would say that this is wrong. In fact, here I attempt, I think, a pretty successful combination of mobility justice with sociological understandings of urban development and urban theory. In any case, the ways a city develops affect the ways justice is delivered or not in it for different social groups. And of course, again, this is overdetermined by the city's movement in time and networks of alliance, what is possible above all. So I will follow this logic in my presentation, a combination of urban theory and also mobilities theory. And here I will revisit the notion of desire. I will say that Boltanski and Tzanelli's work on urban fields is not enough, because we have to consider Rio. First of all, we have to consider Rio in its context. It's not a European city, and it didn't develop only in rationally formed ways, as Boltanski and Tzanelli would argue, following the Baudelsian kind of thesis on distinction. And it does have, Rio has an excess of memory. It had to live through a series of colonial oppressions, internal violence that stemmed, for example, from the dictatorships, and also, of course, the constant need to fit into a system of mobilities that changed over the centuries, but actually they became even more organized in more recent centuries, and in the 21st century. I refer to tourism, to migrations and new technologies. All these mobilities still actually obey to Western and European discursive scripts of civility, what it means to be a civilized country and a civilized city. These are difficult processes and obviously quite important, but I'm not interested in those as such. This is the politics. I'm more interested in the cultural core of Rio and what happens to it, the uniqueness, let's say, of Carioca culture, and how it inserts itself internationally into international mobilities current. So behind this kind of political discursive scripts of civility, we find Rio's indelible core, and sometimes actually Rio or Carioca culture would stand synecdochically for Brazilian cultures. This is something that happens actually in the context of mega events. This core is aesthetic in nature through and through. I don't want to confuse this with the Habermasian split, this analysis between systems and life worlds. Systems being the European discursive scripts of civility, and then life worlds, core of the aesthetic core of Rio. For Habermas does not discuss the role of emotional development in a culture's life world at all. He is a rationalist who can say little about Brazilian movement in time. Actually, he is a European theorist, and he draws on the European experience. So I really have to borrow a bit, but then modify what Habermas has to say about Rio, about the system life world divide in the context of the Rio mega event. So my starting point will be the aesthetic and emotional core of Brazilian culture, not its political alliances or the political economic processes of urban development as such. Aesthetics here is the emotional modus vivendi of a culture, which in intercultural context such as that of the mega event is unfortunately always reduced to a spectacle. Of course, all cultures have an atmospheric core, I would say. The culture of a place such as Rio can only be felt in the ways its people move in everyday life and interact. The way they laugh, the way they dance, the way they fight. These everyday banal mobilities are quite important if we are to assess the aesthetic basis of Rio's culture. So basically, when I'm talking about atmospheres, I'm talking about something that cannot be easily captured in rational ways. It's something that sits between embodied materiality and ethereal effect. Therefore, I need to talk about an economy of desire in the mega event as a form of heterological aesthetics. At the heart of the Olympic mega event rests the reasoning out, a form of rationalization of the other, of the heteron. This is a project which demands of the mega events host to rationalize their uniqueness, to make it intelligible as beautiful civility, as pleasurable art making, but all this leads to a kind of reduction of its essence. In fact, to understand this, to define heterological aesthetics, as opposed to everyday aesthetics, I look to Georges Bataille's The Accursed Share, one of very important books in cultural analysis, and his definition is the pure and simple objectification of a specific character, in this case the Carioca character, which would lead to its incorporation in a homogeneous intellectual system. This intellectual system, in our case, is of course the Olympic mega event and the Olympic values. Let's split this down into two things. In realist terms, this means restoring or ensuring public order. Yes, a demand that leads to quite often to the eradication of particular forms of otherness within the city. And of course, we all know what happened in the favelas in the course of the last decade. And in phenomenological terms, it means attempting to reorganize native aesthetic experience in intelligible ways for Western or international audiences, really. This is the mega event art, an almost impossible task. Both dimensions consigned Olympic Rio's heteronomic project to failure because they scientize Rio and also our minds and hearts and us audiences, and may literally actually lead to the murder of people en masse in order to achieve this kind of flattened out but very orderly image of the city. And the other thing that happens, of course, is that if you are to talk about heteronomics, the heteronomic project, then we refer to definitions of something, Rio's character, in relation to what it is not. Yes, otherwise it's very difficult to capture the atmosphere of a place. And therefore, it was inevitable to compare and contrast what Carioca is about to other forms of culture. But as I said, the process meant the reduction of Carioca culture into an image, really. And if you think about it politically, then you can see that the economy of desire is also a suicidal project by means of population sorting that kills uniqueness of particular life worlds within the city in the name of inclusion in an international community of nations. I want to then dig a little bit deeper into these ideas and try to situate sociologically this economy of desire between structures and agencies. For this I draw on Jeffrey Alexander's structural hermeneutics to a great extent. So Rio 2016's project is split into two conflicting forms of action, I would say, that strive to make its urban life world hospitable to Olympic visitors. On the one hand, we have preventative forms of action, compartmentalizing action, that is necessary to keep the visitors safe. So we have the institution of surveillance technologies in the city, of sorting technologies, of spatial cleansing, evictions, and so forth. This is the kind of punitive aspect. But also we have a creative and imaginative aspect and action. This looks to forms of leisure and art, and specifically forms of leisure and art that tell a story about native ways of being, as well the development and the dialogical constitutions through intercultural encounters. This can be also violent, but usually it is not. Where the preventative action conforms to international rules and regulations, keep people safe. Creative action stands between those and the need to be culturally autonomous. Something which is particularly relevant when we are talking about tourism as a way of being in the world, and art making as a way of making the world in utopian terms. Although this schema seems to follow the Habermasian split between system and life world, in fact it's not identical. What I'm trying to encapsulate here is how this essentially European kind of division between rationality and emotion, politics and aesthetics is inflected through the experience of Brazil and of Rio in modernity, which is aesthetic and emotional in its core. Okay, so we have to look carefully at Brazilian inflections of world making. It's more complicated than it appears at first, because Rio always faces both its colonial and authoritarian legacies. And it's these two that instituted tourism, which is supposed to belong to the creative forms of action. Because tourism in Rio stemmed in terms of hospitality arrangement from multiple migrations to and from Africa, slavery, within Brazil, the industrial movements, and even from Europe and to Europe, even the exiles of the dictatorships. And what you get out of it actually is cultures of multiple mobilities that define the cultural profile of the cities. This is really about mobility, and mobility as a notion, and the idea of movement does connect to notions of European, Western notions of technology in its multiple forms. However, these kind of imported mobilities that produced a governing script for Rio did not erase the spiritual cause of Rio's communities. Of course, when various migrant communities settled in Rio, they too developed, and they settled means they integrated in various degrees, but they did brought in their own culture. So Rio is a quite multi-ethnic, let's say, community, multi-ethnic city. I won't necessarily say multicultural. Multiculturalism points to a value that we can discuss perhaps after the end of the presentation, whether you think that Rio is truly multicultural or not. But the thing that I want to stress is that these multiple mobilities over time brought to the city alternative ways of being, which became especially constitutive of its favela popular cultures, which are mostly these popular cultures of protest, and of course cultures which are very different from the metropolitan ones they established, colonial and metropolitan cultures. So no eradication, but we have the emergence of a split within the process of world making itself in Rio. We have the institution of neoliberal capitalism, and of course the whole mega event is based infrastructurally, is formed infrastructurally on the principles of neoliberalism. And in this respect, we need to start thinking about world making as a form of capitalist expansion, but we also have the other kind of understanding of world making, that of ways of being dialogically and cross-culturally, through which Cariocas can achieve a utopian politics of fulfillment, of togetherness, belonging through time and space, as a unified polity and culture. This is a more peaceful kind of idea, which is yet to be realized, as it were. So let's think about tourism specifically as a Brazilian form of Carioca, specifically world making. In order to develop this split, because the split reappears within tourism and the conceptions, different conceptions of tourism, I draw on Keith Hollinshead's work on world making. World making for Hollinshead is an approach or set of approaches or a panoply of visions that can help draw attention to the rich and varied sorts of things in which tourism is involved or does. An underappreciated human and governing potency, a force majeure in our lives and across our small and large long-run communities of being. So basically what Hollinshead does here is to provide a more tourist-friendly understanding, definition of world making as cosmopolitanism as world making. A kind of dialogical, let's say, approach to cross-cultural development and communication. Here is the split, however, in the case of Brazil at large and Rio in particular. We have Brazilian inflections of tourism as communal well-being, which look to cultures of migration, especially from African territories. And this form of tourism refers to communal well-being, yes, which is the core value in tourism, and can be found in patterns of togetherness as they are articulated in the religion of African Ubuntu. This is a very kind of intimate version that circulates in communities in Brazil, especially the migrant communities that have heritage connections to slavery. This is not something that is marketed, for example, to foreigners as such. It's quite difficult to do so. It's very specific. But we also have tourism as we know it, and that's the second version. And tourism, especially in Rio, concerns not exclusively, but also slum tourism, which is a form of heritage tourism as well. In some cases, because favelas are part of the Carioca cultural heritage. If the first form of tourism is intimate and invites those who discuss it to understand things from within, the second one invites tourism to know about carioca cultures from afar, but never from within. They're just visitors, yes, they are cosmopolitan visitors. The two modes of tourism coexist. Both are addressed as versions of human welfare, yes, well-being, but whereas the former has a phenomenal life, it's multi-sensory, it's holistic, it's post-Cartesian in nature, African Ubuntu thinks of human beings not as part of community only, but also as full human beings that experience the world in all their senses, not just through the gaze, and that they feel the world. The other version of tourism, as we know it, is mostly epistemic in nature. It's about knowing, not about experiencing, in the sense that consumption patterns invite consumers to get to know foreign cultures first and foremost. The experience comes afterwards, if it does, and it's definitely not the immediate experience that is promised by native Brazilian inflections of tourism. Now you can understand what I'm trying to do this here. To think about tourism as Brazilian worldmaking means to problematize tourism and to kind of open up the concept and think of it as more than a process of consumption or as a gazing kind of ritual or even as an embodied ritual. There is more to it if we place it in particular context, cultural context. As we always have to remember also that tourism as a cardinal form of mobility, to think of it as a cardinal form of mobility, is to follow European and Western scripts, yes. Now that was about tourism as a form of world making. Mega event art as world making is also very interesting. Here, the first thing that I have to reiterate is that we must stop conflating the preventative politics of surveillance with the politics of fulfillment that artists allegorize in the mega events art. The first politics I discuss in a book under the rubric of the economy of the artifice or economia artificiale, whereas the politics of transfiguration I term the economy of imagination. To conflate the two and say, for example, that when we deal with tourism or with art in the mega event, we deal with consumption, and therefore we deal with preventative politics and surveillance because everybody is under surveillance in the Olympic City, is wrong. You confuse two different things analytically. The mistake there is that you conflate the Foucauldian gaze of violence, which informs the politics of surveillance, with the gaze of hospitality and creativity, which informs the politics, not the politics, the cultural poetics of creativity. In fact, even the Arendtian gaze is not enough. We have to take on board always that vision is not the only sense that participates in Rio's aesthetic development, and also in its art making. But the second thing that follows on from these conflations is that we begin to accuse the wrong people of the economic maladies that Brazil, the mega event, any mega events host, suffers. In the case of Brazil, of course, and Rio in particular, we have the collapse of the Brazilian economy on the eve of the mega event. And what do you do then? So the accusations leveled at mega event artists that they waste money are really misplaced here. because we infer basically that because we have a conjunction of circumstances which is bad, we can read it as a causal kind of situation. That it's mega event art or the Olympic Games that cause the problem. That's wrong. Indeed, I would say, especially when it comes to the economy of imagination, mega events art, artistic utopias that are produced in a mega event are usually homologous to native understandings of tourism, especially in the case of Rio. Tourism as a form of communal well-being. I will explain in a while why this is so. This is so because most of the mega event artists that were invited to contribute, especially the leading artists, but not only, also the volunteers from the samba schools and from the favelas, know the culture that they narrativize from within. Yes, some of them are organic intellectuals, and others they experience in everyday life culture. They know culture and articulate it in its most banal, let's say, ways. Now, it's quite easy actually for any of you to accuse me of disregarding the fact that the favela participants in the mega event and the lead mega event artists are not the same. The citizenship can be actually questioned, the latter. The kind of recognition each of these groups entertain is different. And of course, we can talk about the presence of inequalities in the city that kind of strengthens this argument. I do not want to disregard the presence of inequalities in the city in my thesis. What I want to argue is that in the mega event artists, and this applies also to some international Olympics policymakers, I just don't examine them here, are not indifferent to them. They take forms of action, yes, in varied kind of degrees of potency. Now, how they take action is determined, of course, by the role. We live in highly organized economic and socially organized nations, and of course we have divisions of labor that account for the things that we can do and the things that we can do well. So I don't want to confuse here mega event artists with policymakers. In fact, I'm making a big point here, and that's why I'm talking about two economies in the mega event. In the context of mega event worldmaking as a whole, we find two forms of critique, however, broadly speaking, of problematic sociocultural realities. We have a social and we have an artistic critique. The social critique is much older than the artistic. It comes, I think, it emerges in about the 19th century when industrialization occurs and urbanization and all the socioeconomic problems that stem from the rise of capitalism, capitalist structuration. It is a critique that is Marxist in nature, and it generally displays institutional mistrust, speaks of labor alienation, exploitation, and the likes. And it is shared actually in the mega event across activist enclaves that operate outside the mega event and sometimes even against it, and some mega event artists. This is a critique that focuses on the bad things that happen to some of Rio's urban life worlds on the event during the mega event. The focus is favela pacification and violence, the disciplining of dissident voices, and organic cultures of Rio for the sake of the mega event. So you can see it's very straightforward kind of activism in more than one ways. And then we have the artistic critique, which is much more recent. It is situated in the 1960s. In the context of the great European and American revolutions against capitalism mostly, but also the rise of subcultures and alternative cultures. It connects to the call for individual and collective freedom from restraints of capitalism, which organizes the world into useful networks, suppresses creativity and supports generally corruption. So the artistic critique is for minority rights, which is why again it is very very anti-favela pacification. And it is also suspicious of bourgeois morality and decency, even when some of its proponents are from this class, from the middle classes. This is a critique that is shared by mega event artists and their volunteering networks from the favelas, and I would also say that it is the core of favelate, the emerging art that connects to the favelas from conventional forms of art that are now displayed in the favelas, to crafts that connect to its cultures, to samba and samba music and so forth. I would say that in Rio's mega event art and architecture, we deal with blends of these two critiques, and they manifest themselves at different points in the mega event ceremonies and beyond in its architecture as well. So I'll give you some examples here. I can only provide a selection of examples, but there is a lot more if you read the book. In terms of social critique, bear in mind that two of the lead mega event artists, Fernando Mirage and Daniela Thomas, tried to reduce the ceremony's budget as a response to the difficulties, economic difficulties that the city was facing. And they did exactly the same to something that was absolutely necessary actually for the delivery of the ceremonies. They reduced technology, the use of technology, to respond again to economic pressures. The interesting thing is how this was articulated by having recourse to native notions of flexibility and resourcefulness. The idea of Jambara, the resourceful kind of carioca, flexible carioca that can manage things, make ends meet in all sorts of crafty ways. Artistic critique was delivered by choreographer Deborah Kolker, who organized a Paralympic flash mob. The idea behind this was to allow people to express the desire to be involved in an artistic experience, which is kind of beyond the rationalized, let's say, organization of the mega event, just for fun, for enjoyment. we can see a kind of connection here to native conceptions of play. Actually, Brazilian at large of play enjoy as happiness, felicidade and jogo. Musical legends and Hungarian intellectuals Gilberto Gil and Citade Maravilosa also exercised forms of artistic and social critique. A lot of the musical narratives that they produced from previous successes, they had kind of tried to fight against this regressive melancholia that kind of informs these days, especially the more conservative political voices in Brazil. And they kind of articulated a joyful musical conviviality, a notion of multicultural belonging. A lot of what they did drew on personal experience of exclusion and exile as well, as organic intellectuals. Another thing that happened artistically specifically connects to the organization of the opening ceremony by Mirage, who began to hint at something that is usually repressed in public presentations and commercializations of favela cultures. He mobilized versions of funk, what are known as baile funk, a completely sequestered culture in the favelas, to my understanding. It's not being commercialized because it's not supposed to be decent enough for this kind of thing, as opposed to the more kind of rationalized versions of samba, for example, that are fully commercialized these days. Baile funk is a kind of dissident and quite angry version of, well, not version, but the equivalent of rap, as it were. And it speaks of the politics of transgression. And the other thing he incorporated, which again was very much against the politics of bourgeois decency in segments of the ceremony, was a kind of ritual that we also observe as well in its commercialized version in Western video clips, Chan, which is the Brazilian equivalent of twerking, a kind of sexualized form of kind of defiance of bourgeois decency as a response to elitist forms of art in performances. And finally, another form of social critique and artistic critique appeared in the Museum of Tomorrow, which is, of course, Rio's artistic architectural wonder that attracts international tourists. There, in collaboration, the main architect Santiago Calatrava, who is the only actually known native lead artist, and Mirage produced a series of videos in which they critiqued human attitudes to climate change, and actually turned the travel through the museum's different parts into a kind of ludic ride, a kind of a way of playing through and going through the motions of climate change and where these can take us, to kind of problematize how we deal in not very responsible ways to climate change. I actually think the mega events versions of social critique the ones that stem from mega event actors are quite interesting because they do address some of the inequalities in the creative city in ways that can be actually contested. Not all of you will like what I have to say here. Okay, I think we can agree that structures of capitalism as a form of world making sometimes overshadow tourism. The core value of tourism is human well-being, yes, cultural exchange, peacemaking, peaceful communication and hospitality. Especially in touristifications of the city, where network professionals in the mega event can answer to expectations to move from one project to the next. Common labor cannot follow sometimes. Either they lack the tools to do that, or quite often the aspiration and interest to develop in this or that given direction. What I'm trying to say is that network professionals that work for the mega event have lots of incentives to participate in it, and they are of course remunerated as well. With the favelados, for example, the favela professionals or volunteers, things are not as easy, and especially slum dwellers who have to act as workers in the tourist industries. This is because on top of their own, of course, political, economic and personal problems, they have to cater for international visitors. And this can create problems. Of course, especially when we are talking about slum tourism mobilities in Rio, we are talking about something necessary for the city's global connectivity. So to have this in the mega event is a must. It's just challenging for localities who have to fit into neoliberal development demands. And this is actually something that is discussed in a much better way in Bianca's work. There are pressures to cater for tourism, the desire to turn favelados into useful citizens, and chronic racial prejudice convince usually local administration to resort to familiar kind of forms of violence. Let's call this the arts of governance. And here it's the irony that the only exit route sometimes for these communities is provided by business networks, in the sense that they may step in to replace this violence with what is possible to be done under the current circumstances, to replace them with the arts of the possible, as it were, because they can grant slum communities sometimes with the only public profile, voice and employment they are lucky to get. And here I would say that the old critique of technology as alienating force is problematic. So think about businesses that kind of use images of these slums, these favelas, and their advertising of these places. We can say that this leads to a project of objectification and commoditization. We can also say, however, that it is an enabler of mobilities. These mobilities of image are quite necessary sometimes to make also people mobile in one particular way, but at the same time keeping them in their place. And therefore one may ask if it wouldn't be preferable to ask first what these communities really want, if they really want to move in these particular ways or not, if they want to participate in commercial kind of activities in business or not, instead of imposing a priori or critical analysis of these business networks. Because sometimes these are the only possible things that can be provided to these communities as a way out of poverty and also a way out of alienation from the rest of the city. It's a kind of bridge between art and policies sometimes. This, what I call arts of the possible, after Adrian Ritz. And I would say also that this is a step towards utopianism, and that could possibly suggest brighter futures, while acknowledging at the same time that we still don't possess the tools to realize them. So I know that I try to challenge some things that are given for us as critical theories, but then we can discuss them here. I will leave you with a series of questions, and of course you may have other questions to ask. I return to my original question: if the mega event heterology is really a suicidal project, and in what ways? Does it destroy Brazilian and Carioca creativity and uniqueness by turning them into spectacles, immutable mobiles that are broadcast to the world? Mobiles that are never to be known from within, however. Does it create resentments within the city world that set one group of citizens against another? Are its professionals and experts mere villains, or subjects caught in the whimsical machinations of neoliberal capitalism? Or are all these questions articulated from a very particular ultra-pessimistic stance, thus destroying any hope before it buds as a project? And finally, what can be done to turn the Olympic project from a utopian promise into a reality beneficial for all? Thank you for listening.